It's a good question, but I don't think you can call tilt. You can't look at something and call
No.
it tilt and make that derogatory.
No, not in the
Of course,
negative
there's
way.
a tilt.
Okay.
In the United States, there has always been, and I think when someone stands up at a meeting like this and says, "Oh, but you don't understand. We're out here in the most rural part of India and so on." Yes, I do understand, because in the United States there are radio stations on Indian tribal, American Indian, whatever the word is here, tribal reservations. These are vast areas and great distances, and they've used community radio for years. They are members of NPR. They're in the organization. They carry some national programs. They are connected. But yes, if a horse goes missing, then that gets announced on the radio station on the Apache Reservation in Arizona, or there's in New Mexico too. There are farm worker stations in California. NPR is not all people driving great big cars. I mean, the U.S. is not all a bunch of wealthy people. There are poor people, there are disenfranchised, unempowered people, and there is radio for them too. And the tilt, yes, there is a tilt toward the urban stations, but that's where the majority of listeners are. It far outweighs the number of people listening to the small stations.
Yeah.
Yes, but it had to be very carefully looked at and examined. NPR was one of the first to do podcasts in the United States years and years ago.
Okay.
And everybody laughed and said, "Oh, that's not ever going to be anything." Well, it's huge. NPR has 5 of the top 10 podcasts in the country, and they've been there from the beginning. You really have to watch the digital realm just as carefully as you watch the broadcasting side. And you have to find the ways to make the digital side enhance what you're doing in the radio. There are streams, different NPR streams, that are not broadcast. And a number of stations have their own streams that are not broadcast. One example would be WGBH in Boston, Massachusetts, which is a classical music station, and they have an extra stream, high-quality stream of what we call Baroque music, music from, say, the 17th, 18th centuries, and it's very popular. And stations are launching streams all the time. They just have to find ways to support them, but fortunately, they're not very expensive. And fortunately, one more thing, excuse me, the music rights have been bought for all of these.
Oh, that is fantastic. That was going to be my next question.
Yeah. Public radio is about news. It has other things, but news is the central core. And it's about any democratic society, and you've heard me say this,
yes,
that citizens must be informed in a democracy in order to vote, in order to know how to vote and what to vote about. And if commercial media will not do it, and in the United States the commercial radio medium has given up on news because they couldn't make money off of it, it's fallen entirely to public and community radio. Now, you said about the music. Yes, absolutely agreed completely. Music is integral to radio and entertainment. And all kinds of music are, whether it's jazz or pop music or, we even have film music. But the public radio does not use that to make money, to make a profit. It's understandable that the people who make music and distribute it want to be paid for their benefit. But when people are using it for purposes not to make a profit, there's a difference. And that difference needs to be recognized by the people who sell music rights and by the people who are in public broadcasting. And so years ago, they established a policy that the federal government would negotiate, along with the broadcasters, the music rights, a complete buyout for whatever they do. and we would keep the music rights people aware of everything. If they add a new music channel in Boston or Philadelphia, that they know about, so that they're aware of the amount of use. But particularly these news stations, where music constitutes a much smaller part of what they do, it's not fair to be billed, and it doesn't happen, that they're billed for music rights on the same basis as a commercial radio station that makes all of its money from playing music. So that's done. The other part of that was the news thing. I'm very aware that news was prohibited from the beginning for FM in India, because we had FM when I was before I retired. We had Indian radio stations asking for permission to air NPR programs, some of which were news programs. And these are for urban areas in India. We're a very sophisticated population. It'd be good to be on FM and to have news from the U.S. And you know that the Indian diaspora is very strong in the United States. And that works both ways. There's Indians very, very interested in what's happening in the U.S. And the U.S. view through reporting of what's happening in the world made a lot of sense, and these stations wanted to carry it. But then it was announced that they couldn't put in news. I think we can all guess at some of the reasons for that mandate, for that order, for that restriction. But none of them are valid. Whatever it is, unless the reason is to incite to violence or to riot, then there's no valid reason, to prohibit news. And if you're worried about some form of speech, whether it be hate speech or incitement or whatever, then you put in the rules and regulations that cover that, and then you enforce them. But to say, no, citizens of India, you may not have information on this part of the spectrum. You're prohibited from having that. And then not giving the reason, how democratic is that? Well, there's always repeating programming, and I don't think it's as horrible a thing as other people do. We have a 2-hour morning news program that is the single most listened to radio program in the United States. It's called Morning Edition. And as you know, we have 3 time zones in the continental United States. So in the morning at 5 a.m. in the East, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, that program goes on the air. And that program is heard for 2 hours. But at 7 a.m., when that initial 2 hours is over, they start all over again. Now, a lot of it is just digitally repeated. Nothing has changed, so they repeat the program. The newscasts, news bulletins, which are the short, do you call them news bulletins
yes,
here?
Bulletin,
news
yes.
bulletins are always live, because the technology allows you a place to just drop them in. And you can't tell the difference. They come in live, and then they end, and then the recorded program begins. And then if anything happens at, say, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, they go on and they change the element that is now outdated. And they're very good at doing that. And you could never, if you lived in San Francisco or Los Angeles in what we call the Pacific time zone, you'd never know that anything had been tampered. It's absolutely seamless. But here's what I'm getting, and like always, I take a while to get back to my point. If we live in the East, there are 6 hours of that program available to a station. And it is very, very common for a station to carry at least 4 of them. So that if the hour that you aired at 5 o'clock in the morning, you then broadcast again at 7 o'clock in the morning with fresh newscast, updated, so on. And you can put in your local news. They're always putting in local information too. Because, people don't uniformly get up at the same time and go to work at the same time. And so repeating in radio is not a crime. It serves the audience better to do it that way. And I think stations should drop the prejudice against repeating and look at it as a benefit for the listener. Well, I mean, the stations in more urban areas can have internet sites and ask their listeners to be part of the internet site as well.
Okay.
And you can explain to listeners that the more they participate in the internet, that helps the station by showing sponsors or potential sponsors a greater reach of the station. Will community radio stations have more listeners than commercial in areas where they compete? I doubt it. Not for a long time. That's just the nature of the way this beast works. But what you can provide is demonstrations of listener loyalty and listener quality. Generally, it's always been true that listeners who want more news, who are more engaged citizens, far more likely to purchase things, they're likely to have a higher income, to be interested in the information and the types of programming you're providing. Now, I know that development radio is to reach everyone, people who have literally no money to spend on anything, and I understand that. And the model doesn't work there, okay? I won't claim that this is the answer to everything, but not every one of these 126, 130 stations is in a desperately poor rural area. And as we go forward, there's plenty of Indians of middle class and above who are going to be served by community radio. And the job of community radio will be to find the ways what that audience wants and needs, because it isn't going to be provided by commercial radio. And I think I can safely say that all India radio cannot always serve every audience. Yes, there is state funding. There is a bit of federal funding. It goes directly to the stations. There's a tiny bit of federal funding, a very, very small amount. It goes mostly to NPR for science programming.
Okay.
And it's rigidly reviewed. It's given in the manner of a scientific research grant.
That is good.
And it's reviewed by scientists and all kinds of people, and very, very carefully done. It's been there for 25, 30 years, so they're very satisfied, because they recognize public radio as a very, very good tool for dispersing, disseminating scientific information. Now, states, yes. There you'll have often statewide public broadcasting networks, and they own a series of FM stations, and generally they all carry the same thing. Or some states will have two channels. One might be classical music oriented, the other more news and information. Generally, a public radio station is a mix of some format of music and information programming, or all information programming, or all music.